Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Sarah, and I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at the microphone next to the podium to answer your questions. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Cheryl L. Neely, celebrating the release of No Human Involved, the serial murder of Black women and girls and the deadly cost of police indifference. Cheryl L. Neely is a sociology professor at Oakland Community College in Royal Oak, Michigan, where she teaches courses in sociology and criminology. She's the author of You're Dead, So What? Media, Police, and the Invisibility of Black Women as Victims of Homicide, which won the Gold Medal Midwest Book Award in 2016. Neely will be in conversation with N.H I. He has been a staff writer at the Washington Post since 2000 and was on the Post team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for the paper's coverage of the Virginia Tech mass shooting. His recent stories on racism, sexism, sexual assault, and hazing at the Virginia Military Institute won a George Polk Award from the Long Island University and the Paul Tobenkin Award for reporting on discrimination from Columbia University. So now, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Cheryl Neely and N.H I.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, everybody, can you all hear me? Okay.
Hello, hello.
Thanks for coming out on a Saturday afternoon to talk about a really important and scary book, but it's essential public service book. My name's Ian, and I'm in conversation with Professor Dr. Neely.
Yes, thank you.
Before we get into it, I just wanted to say that as a journalist, as a fellow researcher, I found this book so definitive. It was one of the values of the book was that it was so definitive. It accumulated so much research and reporting, and generated its own reporting on a subject that is often in the news, but doesn't get collected in such a comprehensive way as this book. So, and I found that when I was reading this book, I wasn't just reading a book that was compiling, details and data about, one serial murder after the next. I was reading a book about these sort of more macro emotional arcs about, indifference, police indifference, media indifference, and then quiet valor from ordinary citizens, including some journalists who were out there. So, and then the last thing I'll say before we get into it is just that for longtime Washingtonians, this book is especially relevant. You may remember 11 years ago, an 8-year-old girl named Alicia Rudd had vanished. And, this was something that still very much haunts the city. Some people still think she's alive. So Alicia Rudd was on my mind. I don't know if you know about this case or not, but hasn't gotten a lot of the press. But anyway, I think we were going to start out with you reading a passage of your choice.
Yes.
So we'll start with that.
I wanted to read a passage from one of the chapters in the book. And the title of the chapters is No Humans Involved, Police Apathy and the Tale of the Grim Sleeper. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Lonnie Franklin Jr., who was responsible for a number of murders of Black women in the 1990s at the height of the crack epidemic in Los Angeles. But I wanted to read part of that. I'm going to go up here to the podium, make it a little bit easier. So this is the beginning of the chapter. At first glance of Princess Berthamew's school photo, one notices her large and expressive eyes, her head slightly tilted to the left, her sweet closed-mouth smile reminiscent of Leonardo da Vinci's 16th century painting, Mona Lisa. She is wearing a lavender sweater, her hair in neat, curly, shoulder-length braids as her eyes gaze upward, not at the photographer. The lack of a direct stare conveys the personality of a shy, perhaps awkward, pre-adolescent, reluctant to pose for the obligatory school picture, but who bravely musters a smile nonetheless. Given the name Princess at birth, a moniker that would suggest parents who regarded their daughter as precious, her life was anything but. Abandoned by her birth mother as an infant in 1986, she was raised by a father whose abuse was so sadistic that by the age of 3, Princess was removed from his custody after being rushed to the hospital for cocaine poisoning. It was there that doctors discovered that the toddler had been both physically and sexually abused, allegedly by multiple men who were friends of her father and bore rope burns from restraints on both her tiny wrists and ankles. I just want to say quickly, perhaps I should have given a trigger warning. We're talking about sexual violence here today, so I just want everybody to take care as they listen. She was also malnourished, didn't smile, and could barely speak. Unlike many foster children, Princess was immediately placed in a home with a devoted and affectionate foster mother who would love the toddler like her own and immediately put Princess under the care of a therapist and enrolled her in private schools. Tragically, 10 years later, her caregiver died of cancer, and her foster father became too ill to continue providing care to the girl, now in her early teens. Samara Herod, the foster family's older daughter, tried taking guardianship over Princess to continue raising her, but Princess began acting out due to the grief and fear from losing the only mother she had ever known. Sadly, the young girl would again enter the foster care system, placed from one home to the next, until, disillusioned and weary of being further abused, she began running away. Once more, Princess became the victim of sexual trauma. She was sexually exploited and trafficked by an older man and raped by a 30-year-old cab driver who was later arrested. Still, the worst was yet to come. Death would claim her before she reached her 16th birthday. At age 15, Princess Berthomieu became the youngest victim of serial killer Lonnie Franklin Jr. On March 19, 2002, several months after she was reported missing by her foster mother, her last foster mother, Princess's new body was found under a shrub in an alley in Inglewood, a neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death. I'm just going to read just this last few lines down. Not only were police accused of failing to conduct a sufficient investigation to apprehend Franklin after he had killed 10 women, but it would also be revealed that police callously referred to the homicides as murders with no humans involved. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Given the subject of what you just read, I'll skip forward to my 5th question. Okay. We'll go right to Lonnie Franklin. So, for those of you who have not read the book yet, the book is organized, is principally organized by sort of essentially murder spree and serial murders, basically. And one of them was Lonnie Franklin, and I felt like in some ways Lonnie Franklin's murders. He killed multiple women and one teenage girl from 1985 to 2007, I believe, and in L.A. in Southern California. And you wrote in your book that police used the acronym N.H.I. to label the victims of the homicides, which is the title of your book, No Human Involved. And I guess my question to you was, why on earth would police use such an obviously non-subtle, but completely denigrating term for victims like this? Like, why do you think they felt like they could get away with that?
Well, basically, they thought they could get away with it because they did not see these victims as having value. As I explained in this particular chapter and in others, it wasn't just police, but oftentimes communities felt a certain way about women that had a background of sex work and drug addiction. And not all of the victims that I cover had that background. But when they know that people don't care about the victims, that they somehow are responsible for their demise, that they contributed in some way by high-risk lifestyles, there's this tendency to dismiss them. And, they say that cops have macabre humor, that they use humor to cope with the tragedies that they see every day. That's no excuse for using such a denigrating term to describe human beings. But these are just victims that don't have much value to them. And if they don't have much value, if their lives don't matter, their deaths won't either. So there's a tendency to just dismiss them.
Well, I found that denigrating term to sort of echo off of what you had also written in the book, which is that serial murderers themselves
Yes.
target women black women who have been caught up in prostitution, drug use, and precisely because they think they're not humans and they are easy targets.
Exactly. There was Samuel Little. I didn't cover his cases specifically, but he was considered the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. He bragged about killing 100 women, but the FBI confirmed at least 60 women. I don't know if you remember this case several years ago. He was arrested for the cold case murders of 3 women, and he was an artist. He actually drew the faces of his victims. And he began to confess to homicide detectives, FBI profilers of all the people he killed. So there was a reporter from the New Yorker that went in to interview him in prison, and because he pleaded guilty. And he was 80-something years old by this time. He was about 80 years old. And she was a white reporter. And he said, I couldn't get away with killing somebody like you. So I went into the ghettos. That's where I hunted. So he knew he could get away with it. Another incident, Anthony Sowell, who committed murders in Cleveland, he killed 11 women and buried them in his house and in his backyard. He told one victim, he called her the B word. He said, scream all you want. Nobody cares about you. You just be a dead crackhead that nobody gave a F about. These men knew they could kill and get away with it because they were targeting women who were vulnerable and who were invisible to police and to the public. These were women that lived in the margins of society, women who had been scarred by early histories of abuse and trauma, who turned to drugs and sex work to support their habits oftentimes, and were just seen as non-human.
Well, and it was so interesting too is that you laid out evidence in your book that police sort of seemed sort of just willfully, ignorant, or they refused to sort of, label a series of murders as the result of a serial murder.
Yes.
Despite the obvious clues that that's exactly what was going on.
Exactly. There's the cases in East Charlotte, North Carolina, the Taco Bell slayer, they called him. This was Henry Wallace. And it was unbelievable. He killed 10 young women. None of these women, not that this matters, but none of these women had a history of sex work or substance abuse. These were hardworking young women. They worked in the fast food industry. Some of them were young mothers. Many of them were college students. With the exception of 2 of the victims, they were all killed in their homes. No sign of forced entry. They were strangled. They were raped. At least 5 of them were found with ligatures around their neck. They were all connected either through school or employment, and they were all connected to one man, Henry Wallace. And yet the police refused to see the patterns of these murders. One of the victims, Shauna Hawk, her mother, Dee Sumter, bless her heart, she was a tireless champion for these women, for her daughter and for the other women that died. And she was a rock in the shoe of police. She was a thorn in their side. But she was like, these obvious connections were always there, but they refused to see them. They refused to call these serial murders.
That's a ever-present theme in the book, is that, again, I call them ordinary people, journalists or parents of victims who were doing like the sleuthing that police should have been doing. I want to go back to the Franklin case, the Lonnie Franklin, the known as the Grim Sleeper.
The Grim Sleeper.
And again, what I found interesting about this case was the combination of the founder of a group called the Black Coalition Fighting Black Serial Killers, and then a journalist at the LA Weekly, Christine Pelisek. Mm-hmm. And this is an example of this guy, Lonnie Franklin, who was killing all these people in LA, and then you had this one moment in the book where they finally get him,
right?
And then the mayor and the police chief do a press conference, and they're bragging, they're boasting that they got this guy, and then in walks this woman,
Margaret Prescott.
And I was wondering if you could talk about Margaret in that moment and what she'd been doing and why that was such a farce. And then I want to shift to the LA Weekly reporter.
Okay.
So we'll start with that.
For more than 20 years, Margaret Prescott took it upon herself to be an activist to alert the community that there were men hunting women in South Central Los Angeles. It was called the Coalition of Fighting Back Serial Murders because there was more than one. There were at least 3 that were operating around the same time. There was Lonnie Franklin Jr., Michael Turner, and Louis Crane. And she had been telling the police that these men, that men were targeting women, that these were serial killers. But again, they were saying there were no serial killings. All of these were disconnected homicides. So she had confronted an LA sheriff's chief of the sheriff's department, and he said to her, "What do you care? They're only killing hookers." So when they finally called Lonnie Franklin Jr., they were having that press conference, and they were saying this was 20 years of dogged police work. We were out here looking for this guy. We never stopped. And she got on the stage, took the mic, and said, "Wait a minute." And she had a file full of, a folder full of documents and all this evidence that she had that they were not actively investigating these cases. And she said, "That is simply not true. My organization, people in South Central LA, we have been on the police about these cases for many times. It was not you all finding him, but it was us putting the pressure to find this man." And she just went on, and at some point they took the mic away. And then, interestingly enough, that evening when it played on the news, they had edited out her interruption. So I had said that you'd had to look high and low to find, I happened to find that video of her interrupting that press conference. But she's extraordinarily courageous.
Yeah, there are lots of heroes like that in the book, and these are the bright spots of this book.
Yes.
Is reading what regular people can do in these cases. The other sort of unsung hero. Make no mistake. I mean, mainstream media often will marginalize and not even cover these deaths at all. Mm-hmm. It might be relegated to a brief in the back of the Metro section, who knows. But the book does highlight the heroic work of local journalists. Mm-hmm. And
yes.
And so I'll get to the Cleveland Plain Dealer later, but I want to talk about, again, with the Grim Sleeper, just very briefly, the genius behind the LA Weekly and the moniker. And mm-hmm. Can you just talk briefly about that? I think it's important to mention.
Yes, the LA Weekly is a newspaper that basically talks about what's happening. It's like a hipster paper that talks about what's happening around LA, music scene, art scene, that kind of thing. But a reporter for the LA Weekly, Christine Pelisek, she had heard about these murders, and she went into the community. She worked with Margaret Prescott and Nana Gunfami, I believe is her name, to get more press about these cases. And she knew that by giving the killer a name, that gets the public's attention. So it was the LA Weekly through her that called him the Grim Sleeper. The reason why they gave him that name is because they believe he took a 20-year hiatus. He started killing in the 80s. He took a 20-year break, and then he started again in the early 2000s. And I believe Princess Berthomew was one of his first victims in the 2000s. So the genius behind LA Weekly's activism, if you will, was to get people's attention about this murder. So the way to get people interested in serial killings is to give a serial killer a name, which is what she did.
Yeah, branding, marketing.
Yes, branding.
I wanted to go back just to set a little bit, just to give you all a sense of background here. There were, again, what makes this book so great is just the storytelling is great. It's just, it's very propulsive. You can't stop reading, and but there are data points that stuck out to me.
Yes.
And I wanted just to read back a couple data points that stuck out to me that kind of, I guess, shouldn't have shocked me, but they did, if I'm being honest. Black women make up 7% of the U.S. population, mm-hmm. yet they comprise 36% of homicides. That was 2018 data. And then you zeroed in on Cleveland for a little bit. So the book kind of hops around from city to city. Cleveland, a little bit of Louisville, sorry, and I'm a native of Louisville, and then L.A., Boston, Detroit. But in Cleveland, 70% of women reported missing in the city have been Black, while they only make up 30% of the people in the county, surrounding county.
Right.
That just shocked me, and I wasn't sure, just very briefly, if you could touch on just whether you got that sense that was sort of, that disproportionality was sort of pervasive across the country in other major cities.
Yes, it is, unfortunately. A disproportionate number of missing individuals tend to be people of color, Black people in particular. And it's difficult oftentimes for family members to even get police to take missing persons reports seriously. One of the cases I start with, the first chapter of the book is But First, Michelle. Yeah. I hope I'm not going a little bit ahead of your question.
That's the next thing I was going to ask you about.
But I talk about my friend who was murdered in 1984, 16-year-old Michelle Kimberly Jackson. And her family tried to report her missing. She didn't show up for school. And they were saying, well, she's probably a runaway. They said she would never run away. She comes from a good home. She's very loved. Well, maybe she's got a boyfriend. Maybe there's a boyfriend you guys don't know about. And the mother was like, I haven't seen my daughter. Please, would you look for my daughter? They said, look, we give it 24 hours. And if we're not looking for her fast enough, find her your damn self. This is what the cops said to her. Well, they did the next day. Her mother and her aunt and her cousin found her body. And that very same police officer was the one offering this broken mother, this absolutely devastated mother, a ride home from the crime scene. Throughout this book, you will read about family members who have tried to report their loved ones missing, and they were rebuffed. So the numbers of, missing Black people could be even higher than the ones that are actually officially reported.
It's so shocking too. Like, we'll wait 24 hours. It seems like the first 24
16.
hours are the most important.
Exactly.
I mean, this was sort of a doubly sad case. Your friend Michelle Kimberly Jackson, she was sexually assaulted and strangled in January 1984. An innocent man was convicted for her killing, Eddie Lloyd. He was eventually released in 2002, maybe? And
yes, 2002.
He died a couple years later, and then they finally caught the guy, the actual killer. And I was going to have you read from that one section, the epilogue, if you wanted just to read.
Yes, I'll read
if you don't want to, you don't have to.
Oh, no, I don't mind.
This was the epilogue of the book is this beautifully written lyrical part about her friend.
This is the epilogue. Last night, I dreamt of Michelle, of a solo walk down a dark, cold street, of distant stars dotting the black sky, and clouds of breath escaping from her mouth as she buried her face in the collar of her winter jacket in search of warmth. I saw her in my mind's eye, standing at the bus stop, finally making it to her destination, still shivering from the sharp cut of a frigid wind, casting furtive glances down Finkel Avenue in search of a bright light that would signal an approaching bus. Maybe she saw him standing across the avenue under a street lamp, attempting to look inconspicuous, yet watching her intently. Maybe, she thought, perhaps fleetingly, she should make her way back to Jody's house. That was her cousin who she lived with. A safe space, home. But missing her first class during finals week would be too much of a risk for an honor student with hopes of college in her immediate future. Her grade point average must be protected, so her uneasiness must be quelled. The bus would come soon enough. Did she see him cross the street and approach her menacingly? Or was he stealthy, like a shadow, suddenly upon her with a knife pressed to her neck, commanding in a harsh whisper that she stifle her scream? Either way, there he was with a knife and a plan. The garage he chose for his attack, to obscure the barbarity from public view, must have been considered in advance. He forced her to walk with him, holding the knife to the side of her neck, fervently glancing from one direction to another to ascertain if he had an audience. The woman who only moments before noticed Michelle, and then the man watching her from across the street, was gone now. She would provide a description of him to the police within the week. Once he spotted the vacant cement garage just 1 block north of the bus stop, he hurried toward it, pushing Michelle forward. When he got to the door, he pressed his body against it, expecting to be allowed entry, but it was blocked from the other side. With the next attempt, he used his body weight to force the door open and quickly drag my friend, his prey, into his dark cavern. So I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. That was great. I wanted to switch cities to Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown. Maybe the most famous case that you discuss is the Breonna Taylor case.
Yes.
Which has been in the news a lot. Was recently in the news just a couple months ago. And you know, when I was reading this, your account of what happened, you know, I could not help but feel so shocked again about that incident in which police, you know, used a battery ram to, you know, and wound up shooting an EMT, Breonna Taylor. I think, like, to me, that incident reflected so many of the themes of your book. Again, police indifference, and what I mean by that is that, strangely, when she was shot, they forbade medical intervention to save her life.
Exactly.
I was just shocking to me. You know, when we read these articles in real time, when the Breonna Taylor story broke, and when there was more coverage of it, some details like that can slip through the cracks. But I felt like it was important to mention that. And then the biggest hole in that was just that no officers were charged directly with her killing. The federal government did swoop in, and they filed civil rights abuse charges. And one of the officers was just convicted and does face life in prison.
Exactly.
But I wanted to ask you, just in general, you know, why the Breonna Taylor case to this day, it happened in March, right at the beginning of the pandemic, why it embodies so many of these themes that you've been discussing.
It embodies a lot of things. It kind of encapsulates something that Malcolm X once said when he said the most unprotected, neglected, disrespected person in America was the Black woman. And we saw that with Breonna Taylor's case, when here's a hardworking EMT tech who's also in school for nursing, whose home was entered with a no-knock warrant. Her boyfriend shot through the door because he thought it was a home invasion. The police didn't announce themselves. And then she, unfortunately, was shot and killed. When her boyfriend, Kenneth, fired the weapon, one of the officers got hit in the leg. So the EMT did come to the scene, but police told them to work on the cop while she struggled to breathe for about 5 minutes or 5 to 20 minutes before she finally died from her injuries. But the fact that she could be killed by police in the presence of police, and even though they made a terrible mistake, so they say, they still wouldn't allow her life to be saved. That was complete and utter apathy. Yeah. And that is the theme of this book.
And I think what was so disappointing to many people in the Black community, particularly in Louisville,
yes,
was that the Attorney General, the first Black Attorney General in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, enabled this.
Yes,
basically.
Exactly. I forget his name now. Cameron.
Yeah.
And and the interesting thing about that is that the grand jury that was convened on the case, they were waiting to hear evidence that the police had shot and killed Breonna. But they complained later. They wanted it known because the Cameron, the prosecutor, has said that the decision not to charge the officers were up to the grand jury. They pushed back saying, you never gave us evidence showing us that the police were culpable for her death. We never got that evidence. So we want the public to know that had we been presented with evidence that the police were directly responsible, we would have rendered a decision along that line. We never got that evidence. And they were also told by Cameron that the police were not responsible. So for a prosecutor to convince the jury to kind of, shape the decision that they came to, they felt was just disrespectful to the victim. There's
so many instances when you read this book of institutional failures, just throughout, you know, whether
Yes.
it's the police department of a city, whether it's the attorney general's office. And in the case in back, I'm going to skip to another city now, and I believe it's Cleveland. Um, um, I'm going to discuss the case of Christopher Whitaker, another murderer. We actually don't know if he was a serial murderer, but we think he might be.
They believe he might have been, given what he did to his young victim.
So this case was really, one detail in this case popped out at me, which was, this is a guy who murdered a young woman, Eliana DeFries, in 2017. She was on her way to school when he abducted her and killed her. And look at my notes again here. And you know, he had. I think what's really bothered me was that this guy was only given 4 years in prison. In the early 2000s, he nearly killed a woman.
Yes.
He was only given 4 years. He shouldn't have been out in the streets in the first place, frankly. But the one detail that really bothered me was that the school, like she doesn't show up at school, and the school didn't tell the family that she was missing, and then they lied about it.
Yes,
and then the family sued the school, and in one of the tiny victory, but a pretty big victory, they won $1 million.
They won $1 million.
And I just was like, they lied about it. And they not only failed to, anyway, just if you wanted to touch on that.
Yes, they lied. Eliana DeFries was a 14-year-old girl. Precious little baby. The pictures of her, if you Google her, the smile, she was just full of love and life. And she was abducted by Christopher Whitaker on her way to school. She never made it home from school. The family called the school, and the school, I guess, confirmed that she had not made it to school. But then when the family complained that they never were told, the school lied and said they did, in fact, report that she was missing as soon as they noticed she never made it to class. The small victory of $1 million was there, but also they passed a law called Eliana's Law, where schools are obligated by law to inform a parent if a child does not make it to school. Teachers take attendance at the top of class, and they also verify attendance at the end of class. And if a child does not report, they're to let the principal know, and the principal notifies the family. That came about as a result of Eliana's case. But the fact that Christopher Whitaker had raped and stabbed a woman twice in the neck with a pair of scissors in her own home, he only got 4 years. So he was out on the street to kill Eliana because he didn't get enough time for the first assault.
Yeah. I'll just bring up one more case, and then we can open up to questions. And I'll stay in Cleveland, and to talk about a guy named Anthony Sowell. He killed 11 women.
Yes.
And again, I just go back to, I mean, it's sort of, I guess it's a little bit convenient to, hindsight and all that Monday morning quarterback and all.
Exactly.
But I was reading this case and I was like, people are calling police, health officials because they're smelling something. Okay, and I don't need to go into all the details, but they're smelling what anybody would know what it was. And
absolutely.
The police refused to go out there, and I just was like, really? I couldn't believe that.
And one of the most egregious things is that the police claim, because Anthony Sowell was a convicted sex offender, so he had to register. And they claim that they were going to the house and checking to verify that he lived at the address and that he hadn't, quote unquote, gotten into trouble. How could you then go to that home? The smell blanketed the entire community. There was a sausage shop right down the street from Anthony Sowell's home where he had killed the victims and buried them in his home. It was called Ray's Sausage Shop. People thought maybe it was rotten meat. So he had the drain pipes replaced, all these things replaced in his factory, thinking that maybe he was distinct, as he says in the book. But he wasn't. And if police were actually going to the home, knocking on the door, how could they not notice that smell? But when he attacked a woman who actually escaped, went to the hospital, reported, and there were women that he attacked and had escaped, and police mocked them, laughed at them, and didn't take the report seriously because, again, these women had sex work and drug addiction in their background. When they finally went to the house to interview him, 3 weeks after he attacked this woman, they noticed the smell right away. And that was enough for them to enter the home with cadaver dogs, and that's where they found the victims that he had killed.
I was reading that section where I thought it really hit home, and I was like, if this was Beverly Hills or the
Absolutely.
Hamptons, this would, I mean, they would have
No
been all
way.
over it. No way, exactly. So that was one of my takeaways. And anyway, I have more questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. But this is a tremendous book, incredible.
Thank you.
Book of scholarship and journalism all in one. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
So we should open it up to questions. There's a microphone there, and I guess I've done this before. So I guess the only thing I'll say is it's a Q&A, so not an op-ed day. So come up to the microphone, ask a question, and she'll answer it. So.
Well, hello there. In your book, do you provide examples of how the race of the victims matter to the police?
Yes, absolutely. Because people might say, well, maybe it was the fact that these women were sex workers that police didn't care. I present to you the case of Arthur Shawcross, who in the late 1980s, early 1990s, killed 11 sex workers. When he killed these sex workers, police officers canvassed the neighborhood, talked with sex workers, promising them, we're not here to arrest you. We want information. If you've ever been with anybody, a John or a Trick as they called them, that made you feel uncomfortable, that made you feel threatened in some way, please report that to us immediately. They began to gather tips. They warned the women that was a man stalking them. They convened a violent criminal apprehension task force, which is what you're supposed to do. Once you declare that a series of killings are the work of a singular offender, or a serial killer, you have to convene a task force that involves the detectives directly involved, the county, and the FBI. They brought in profilers to profile this guy, to find him. And within maybe months of this task force, they arrested Arthur Shawcross. What was the difference between Shawcross's victims and Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s victims and Anthony Sowell's victims? The fact is those women were all white. So even though they were sex workers, who people might not feel had much value based on their occupation, police had a completely different response. And then there are some other examples. There was one case in Chicago where this woman, and she wasn't a sex worker, she was an older woman who they believe was killed by her boyfriend. Police believed that they had dumped her body. He had dumped her body in a dumpster, and they knew the landfill where that body would have went based on surveillance cameras. Her daughter wanted them to find her mother's body so they could bury her. And they said it would cost millions and millions of dollars. And nobody ever goes to a landfill and finds the body of a victim. Well, I unearthed at least 2 cases where white women had died, and police went to the landfill and combed that landfill and found those women's bodies. And they were white women. So again, if the victims' lives don't matter, their deaths don't matter either.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm a community psychologist, and for many, many decades, I work on violence prevention here with the American Psychological Association. And listening and what are you talking, my mind is, how can we prevent those things? That's what I work my whole life. Because this is not something that someone one day just think about, oh, no, I'm going to start killing women. Something happened to this man, to those men, that made them so mad, so difficult, especially toward the women. So I'm always thinking about how can we educate the people to think about what can we do to help boys and old men and younger men to not to get to that point. Mm-hmm. Because this is someone who had terrible experiences with women, and they saw them like only using for sex or to kill them because they are awful. So, how can we think about what made this man like that? Why is he so mad at women that he needs to kill them? And so, have you thought about those things? Have you read, our research about those issues?
When I
Thank
wrote,
you.
oh, thank you. When I wrote my master's thesis, it was called Prelude to a Kill, Changes in the Economic Status of Women and Intimate Partner Homicides of Women. And I tried to find a correlation between women's economic status improving and the rates of women being killed by male partners. So I read a book by Adam Jukes called Why Do Men Hate Women? Your question is an excellent question. It's a very complex question because it requires, and I'm speaking as a sociologist, it requires a complete cultural shift, a paradigm shift in the way women are seen, and we have to get at the culture of toxic masculinity. But it also encompasses the way children are raised and abused, because a lot of these men, this is not an excuse, but this is an explanation. A lot of these men come from sadistically abusive homes. And it troubles me, and I love animals. I have a dog named Rosie. I love her to pieces. But it troubles me that we see so many commercials about shelters and helping wounded animals. But how often do we see commercials about the impact of child abuse? How many commercials do we see about rescuing children from terrible homes? How many times do we talk about how these foster care systems oftentimes repeat the same abuse these children are trying to escape? And at 18 years old, when they no longer have any kind of economic incentive, they kick these kids out. We as a society have to care more about our children. We have to invest in them. We have to invest in our young boys if we want to prevent this. But we can. But do we have the will to change it? That's the question. So I appreciate your question very much. Yes, no doubt. Thank you for the work that you do.
Hi, I just want to say
Oh,
thank you so much for your work. It's profound, it's heartbreaking, but it's necessary.
thank you.
My question is, how did you separate yourself as an author, as a research, as a writer, writing about the victimization of Black women specifically, with you being a Black woman? Did that take an emotional toll on you? And or did you find being a Black woman, did you use that as motivation to write a book?
That's an excellent question. Both. It was a motivating factor, but it was also very emotionally taxing for me. Max Weber, sociologist many, many decades ago, centuries ago, once said that sociology should be value free, that our personal history and experiences shouldn't enter into what we see because then we can't be objective. But I am part of the very phenomenon that I am studying. So in studying these cases, somehow miraculously, I was able to somehow emotionally disconnect. But a very strange thing happened at the end of the book. When I finished my book and I turned it into my beautiful and brilliant editor, Maya Fernandez, something happened. I went into a deep depression and I cried about it often because I had carried these women with me for 4 years as I wrote their stories. And I wrote a book some years ago called You're Dead, So What? Media Police and the Invisibility of Black Women as Victims of Homicide. So I'd done this work since 2009. I felt their spirits kind of part from me. I had carried them in my heart for so long, but when the book was finished, I kind of felt their spirits part from me, like, thank you for telling our stories. Excuse me for getting emotional. And then I went into a depression. And that's when I realized that being part of this phenomenon can be difficult, but it's necessary. Because I realized that I am speaking for people who no longer speak for themselves. So it is important that their stories be told. But I'm reminded of the movie Shakespeare in Love when at the end, Queen Elizabeth looks at him and says, Master Shakespeare, next time a comedy. Because Romeo and Juliet was so sad. So my next book will probably be a lot lighter, but I'm glad I wrote it. But thank you for your question.
Hello, Dr. Neely.
Hello.
Wonderful book, and I
Thank
appreciate
you.
all of your work. I do have a question. I read your first book and now this one. Could you speak to your research when you had to reach out to police stations or to pull your data? Did you have to interact with any detectives, even some that are still living that remember the case? Did you have any pushback? What was your experience when you were
That's a good
working with the
question.
police departments or prosecutor or whomever you talked to get your information?
I did for both books. I worked with police officers, and a lot of the police officers, interestingly enough, especially with the first book, You're Dead, So What, they were more forthcoming and admitting that race played a factor in the way police see homicide victims, were African American officers. I talked with white detectives who would say, well, in my personal experience, I've always seen all victims as having value. So there was some tendency to deny. But one of the officers I spoke to, especially in the case of my friend Michelle, I had to change his name for confidentiality reasons. I called him Isaac Tabb in the book. He was very forthcoming. He admitted readily that the man who was accused of killing my friend Michelle, Kenneth Dupree, had confessed to 7 other murders. As a matter of fact, he took Isaac Tabb and other cops around to show them where he had dumped bodies. But when I talked with the prosecutor and the detective for the prosecutor's office, they told me, well, we cannot comment on an ongoing investigation, when I tried to verify that this man had killed before. But Isaac Tabb, when I was interviewing him, he kept referring to Dupree as a serial killer. So I said, you keep calling him a serial killer, was he? Oh, yeah. He confessed to 7, but I believe he did more. He actually sent me a video of him in the backseat of the detective car, Dupree, while they were looking at places where he said he dumped bodies, telling Isaac Tabb how much he appreciated the way he respected him when he talked to him. I found it quite strange and just, it was shocking to me. But I appreciated him giving me that information. And I asked him, I said, do you think after, what happens when he confessed? He said, well, we turn all that over to the Violent Criminal Apprehension Department and the FBI to verify. I said, do you think that they'll let the families know of these victims? He said, probably not, because it would open up a whole can of worms, because an innocent man went to prison for this guy, and for 35 years, they didn't catch him. So they're going to have to ask her some questions as to why he wasn't caught sooner. So more than likely, nothing will come of it. This is what he told me. Hi.
Hi, thank you for your work.
Thank
and
you.
Your passion. And
Thank
know
you, I
how
appreciate
painful that was. Kind of piggybacking on a couple questions. Did you ever have an opportunity to interview any of the suspects?
No, I did not.
Okay, all right. That was my question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, Dr.
Hello.
Neely. How
Hello.
are you?
I'm fine.
Good. So, you answered one of my questions earlier, but first, I just wanted to say, I lost a niece. She was murdered in Detroit, and when they
Sorry to hear that.
investigated, this is many years ago. Thank you. When they investigated, found 2 marijuana plants in her basement, and therefore determined that she was a drug dealer, and never did any work on her case. So when I'm hearing you talk about this, it brought everything up for me. I feel as a Black woman, I'm exhausted, and you must be
Absolutely.
exhausted too.
Yes.
And we've entered into a new era in this country, and I fear that the things that you're writing about are never going to change.
Yes.
And I don't know what I can do. I'm afraid to read your book because I'm afraid that it's going to do something to me that I can't control.
Right.
And I don't know what to do.
Well, we're in a very difficult era in America right now. I think we all understand that. And oftentimes I'm asked the question, well, do you think things will get better in the future? And I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King, a couple of quotes from him. And one was when he said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but it happens through continuous struggle. We've been struggling for a long time. Black women have been on the forefront of most activist movements to change the conditions of Black people and of others, because other groups have benefited from our hard work, but it is absolutely exhausting. Another thing he said was, the time to do the right thing is right now. I don't think that change inevitably comes. Unless there is a paradigm shift, it does not come. But we have to start mattering. And I don't know any other way to say it. Even in the conclusion of the book, I talk about all the ways that Black women have contributed to the building of this society. When will we finally matter? I appreciate you being honest that this book is difficult for you to read, and it may be difficult for a lot of you, and that's the fear of writing a book like this. But it's important because these women's stories have to be told. And for those of you that don't like to read a physical book, I cannot say enough how Karen Chilton, who is the narrator of this book, is absolutely phenomenal. Her reading this book, I was like, I wrote that? Wow! But I'm telling you, this book, it reads like history, sociology, and also true crime for those of that like true crime. It's not a true crime book, but I talk about murders in a way that may be reminiscent of that genre. But it's an important book, and I hope for the sake of the families, and there's so many heroes in this book, the families of these women, it's a shame that they have to endure the trauma of not only losing their loved ones, but the trauma of doing the work that police are paid and commissioned to do. But for the sake of the victim's family, and humanity, I think it's important to tell this story.
Okay.
I think it's very important what you do, and I'll say to everybody here that it's possible. It's important to get with some groups, some churches, some political parties, or someone that we can find and help those men and those boys to have a good life and not to be criminals. It is possible. It is possible. There are tons of organizations. There are tons of groups in this country. If you go to the churches, if you go to universities, or if you go, even here, they know about those things. Here, the Politics and Prose knows. So I would not discourage people, to go and face those issues. It's possible to change boys, men, and women. I worked for more than 30 years here in my country, in Brazil, and we can change those things.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I want to congratulate you again on your book.
Thank you.
And it's
Thank you, Ian.
available here at this bookstore and anywhere books are sold.
Thank you.